In the autumn of 539 BC, the king of the most powerful city on earth threw a party. Outside the walls, an enemy army was waiting. Inside, nobody seemed worried. That army had been camped there for weeks, watching the walls, watching the gates, waiting for something they could not yet see. The walls of Babylon were so thick that 2 chariots could drive side by side along the top of them. No army had ever broken through. Other cities had fallen to Cyrus in weeks. Babylon had outlasted every siege thrown at it for generations. So the king filled golden cups, stolen years earlier from a conquered temple, and toasted to a city that could not fall. Then a hand appeared. No body, no arm, just a hand, writing on the plaster wall in front of everyone. Cups slipped from hands and shattered on the floor. Several guests scrambled backward from the table, chairs toppling behind them. Nobody could read it. Not the king's wise men, not his priests. Not a single person in the room, until they brought in a prisoner who could. He read 4 words, and by morning, the most powerful empire on earth was gone. To understand how something this powerful could collapse in one night, you have to understand how powerful it actually was. Decades earlier, Babylon had a different king. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II, and he built the city into something the world had never seen. He built towering walls, a grand processional road, and a massive blue gate dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, covered in glazed bricks shaped like lions and dragons. And, according to legend, he built gardens that climbed into the sky, watered by machines that lifted river water up, terrace after terrace, for his homesick queen. These became 2 of the most famous structures in the ancient world. The Ishtar Gate, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also rebuilt the city's Great Ziggurat, a massive stepped tower dedicated to the god Marduk, so tall it could be seen from miles outside the city. Some historians believe this tower is the real origin of an even older legend, a story about a tower that reached too high and was never finished. Historians still aren't sure the Hanging Gardens were even real. No firm archaeological trace of them has ever been found in the city itself. But the walls were real, the gate was real, and the city's reputation as the greatest place on earth was real, too. But Nebuchadnezzar did not live forever, and the kings who came after him were not like him. One king ruled only briefly before being pushed aside. Eventually, the throne went to a man named Nabonidus, who was not even from the royal family. Nabonidus was strange by Babylonian standards. He left the capital for years to live in a remote desert oasis, worshipping a moon god instead of Babylon's own patron deity, Marduk. That single choice mattered more than it should have. The priests of Marduk, the most powerful religious figures in the city, never forgave him for it. And while the king was away in the desert, he left the throne in the hands of his son, a young man named Belshazzar. Outside Babylon's borders, a much bigger problem was growing. A Persian king named Cyrus was building an empire faster than anyone in the region had ever seen. Cyrus had already conquered the Medes. He had already conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia. City after city had fallen to him, sometimes without even a fight. Babylon was the obvious next target, the richest, most fortified city left standing in his way. There was another reason Babylon was not worried. Cyrus had conquered every other city through siege warfare, patience, and direct assault. He had never once needed to outthink a city. He had simply outlasted them. Babylon's advisors assumed this siege would be the same. Wait long enough, and the river and the walls would do the rest of the work for them. But nobody in Babylon seemed especially worried. The walls had never fallen. The river ran straight through the middle of the city, so they could never be starved out. And the city had enough stored grain, by some ancient accounts, to last for 20 years. So when Cyrus's army finally arrived and camped outside the walls, the people of Babylon simply went on with their lives. Belshazzar himself had been warned. Advisors had urged him to take the siege more seriously, to reinforce the guard, to postpone any celebration until the threat had passed. He waved the concern away. The walls had held for generations, but was one more army camped outside them, which brings us back to that autumn night and the party that should never have happened. Belshazzar, the young king left in charge, decided to host a massive feast for his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. And to impress his guests, he ordered something specific to be brought out. The golden and silver cups his father had looted years earlier from the temple in Jerusalem. These were not ordinary cups. They were sacred vessels, taken from a god other than his own, and he used them to drink wine and toast to idols of gold and silver. It was, by every account, an act of enormous disrespect, and it was about to be answered. In the middle of the celebration, the air in the room changed. Conversations slowed, then stopped entirely. Because on the plaster wall, in full view of the king and every single guest, 4 words appeared, written by a hand with no arm attached to it. Belshazzar's face went pale. His knees, according to the ancient account, literally began to shake. He called for his wise men, his astrologers, his magicians, every advisor in his court who claimed to understand hidden meanings. One astrologer pressed close to the wall, squinting, certain he almost had it, before stepping back, shaking his head. Another simply stood frozen, staring at the symbols as if staring harder might force them to make sense. A third turned to the others and admitted, in front of the king, that he had never seen anything like it in his life. Not one of them could read it. The words were there, plain as anything, and yet completely unreadable to every single person in the room. While they waited for him to arrive, nobody moved from their seats. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Then someone in the room remembered a prisoner, a foreigner, taken captive decades earlier, who had a reputation for understanding things no one else could. His name was Daniel, and when he was finally brought before the terrified king, he did not look impressed by any of it. Daniel looked at the wall. He read the 4 words instantly, and then he turned to the king and told him exactly what they meant. Mene, your reign has been measured, and it has come to its end. Tekel, you have been weighed and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to others. Daniel finished speaking. The room stayed completely silent. Belshazzar did not argue with him. He did not call for guards to remove him. He simply sat there, the golden cup still in his hand, and said nothing at all. Whatever confidence had filled that room an hour earlier was gone. Nobody reached for their wine again that night. And while all of this was happening inside the palace, something else was happening just outside the city, in total silence. Cyrus's engineers had spent days upstream, digging new channels to redirect the Euphrates River away from its normal course. They had been waiting for exactly this night, a night when the city's attention would be turned entirely inward. That night, with the city distracted by its own feast, the engineers gave the order. The channels opened completely. Inside the city walls, the river that ran through Babylon began to drop, lower and lower, until the riverbed beneath the water gates was nearly dry. For a moment, the soldiers at the riverbank simply stood and watched the water disappear, almost in disbelief that the plan was actually working. Persian soldiers waded into the shallow water, walked beneath the city's own gates, and entered Babylon from below, through the one entrance nobody had ever thought to guard. The walls that had never been broken by force did not need to be broken. The army simply walked underneath them. Inside, the streets near the palace were quiet. Most of the city had no idea anything was wrong. Persian soldiers moved through the streets toward the palace, meeting almost no resistance at all. Babylon held religious festivals throughout the year, days when ordinary rules relaxed, and the whole city turned its attention to celebration rather than defense. Some accounts say there was a festival happening that very night, the kind that came around once a year, and the city guards had not wanted to miss it. One by one, they slumped against the gateposts, cups tipped over, spears left leaning, unattended, against the wall, and were too distracted to notice an army walking quietly through their own streets, past their own gate, toward their own king. They moved past empty guard posts and through halls meant to be the most heavily watched in the entire city. By the time anyone in the palace realized what was happening, the soldiers were already inside. Far away in his desert oasis, Nabonidus had no idea any of this was happening. He was still tending to his moon god, hundreds of miles from his own capital. By the time word reached him that his city had fallen, there was nothing left for him to defend. His own kingdom had ended without him in the room. That same night, back in the palace, Belshazzar was killed. By morning, the city that had never fallen in centuries belonged to someone else. Ordinary people woke up that morning to a city that looked exactly the same as the night before, and yet was no longer theirs. Word spread through the markets and the streets before most people even reached the palace gates to see for themselves. When word reached Cyrus that the most fortified city in the world had fallen in a single night, with barely a battle fought, even he seemed to pause at how easily it had happened. Cyrus walked through the gates, not as a conqueror tearing a city apart, but almost as a liberator. He spared the population. He kept the temples standing. He even allowed a group of exiled people, the same ones whose temple vessels Belshazzar had drunk from that night, to return home. One elderly man in that group had been a child when he was first taken from his home. He had never expected to see it again in his lifetime. Now he stood at the edge of the road, an old man, finally given permission to walk home. Behind him, the rest of the group followed, carrying what little they owned, a distant temple silhouette waiting on the horizon ahead of them. So what actually destroyed Babylon? Not one single thing. A king who alienated the priests who were supposed to protect him. A son who insulted a god that was not his own on the one night it mattered most. Walls that were strong enough to stop any army, but were never designed to stop a river from being moved, and a piece of writing on a wall that nobody could read until the one person who could told them it was already too late. Babylon did not disappear that night. The city kept standing for centuries afterward, under new rulers, slowly fading rather than being destroyed. But the empire that built it, the empire of Nebuchadnezzar's golden gates and floating gardens, ended in a single night, between one drink and the next. Every defense Babylon had was real. The walls were real. The grain stores were real. The river was real. None of them were the weakness. The weakness was a king who insulted the wrong god on the wrong night, and a guard who wanted to enjoy one festival too many. The greatest cities in history are not destroyed by the absence of strength. They are destroyed by the presence of a single overlooked weakness at the exact moment nobody is paying attention.